Around the year 50 AD, a young church in a busy Roman port city received a letter that would end up in your Bible. The city was Thessalonica, a wealthy trade hub on the Via Egnatia, the great road linking Rome to the east. The letter came from a man they trusted deeply, who'd been driven out of their city by a mob only weeks after founding their church, the Apostle Paul. Acts chapter 17 tells us what that founding looked like. When Paul preached in Thessalonica, a mob dragged his host, a man named Jason, before the city's officials, called politarchs, a title archaeologists have actually confirmed was unique to Macedonian cities like this one, carved into inscriptions found in the region. The accusation against the Christians was that they were turning the world upside down and proclaiming another king, one Jesus, a direct challenge to Caesar. That's not a small charge in a Roman city. It's treason. Paul had to leave at night to save his life. The believers he left behind were a persecuted minority in a city fiercely loyal to Rome. And Rome had a message for cities like this one. Submit, and you get the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This wasn't just a phrase. Augustus himself had commissioned an altar in Rome called the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, and coins circulating across the empire, including in Macedonia, were stamped with claims of the peace and security Rome guaranteed its loyal cities. It was imperial branding, repeated everywhere. So when Paul picks up those exact two words, peace and safety, in chapter 5 of his letter, his audience would have felt it instantly. He's taking the empire's own slogan and turning it into a warning. Let's read the full passage, King James Version, verses 1 through 3. But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. Let's slow down and take this piece by piece. Times and seasons. Paul opens by saying the Thessalonians don't need him to write about times and seasons. And in the Greek, that's two distinct words, chronos, meaning clock time, sequence, duration, and kairos, meaning the right moment, the appointed season, the significance of a moment rather than its date on a calendar. Paul isn't saying, you already know the date. He's saying, you already understand how this works. It's not a calculation, it's a posture. So much confusion in this space, then and now, comes from people treating kairos language as if it were chronos, trying to calculate a date out of a warning that was never about dates. As a thief in the night. This phrase isn't original to Paul. He's quoting Jesus. In Matthew 24:43, in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says almost the identical thing. If the homeowner had known what hour the thief was coming, he'd have stayed awake. Paul had likely heard this teaching passed down directly from the apostles, and the phrase clearly stuck. Decades later, Peter uses the identical image in 2 Peter 3:10, warning scoffers who ask, where is the promise of his coming, that the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night? Two different apostles, writing to two different churches, decades apart, reaching for the same image Jesus used. That's not coincidence. It tells us this was a settled, widely taught expectation in the earliest church, not one writer's private theory. Peace and safety. We touched on this already, but it's worth sitting with the actual words a moment longer. Arena, wholeness, things set right, more than an absence of conflict. Asphaleia, literally, without stumbling, a confidence nothing will trip you up. Paul takes Rome's own promise and makes it the very phrase that precedes disaster. The roots go back centuries before Paul. This theme, false peace right before judgment, runs straight through the Old Testament prophets, and Paul's Jewish readers in Thessalonica's synagogue would have caught every echo. Jeremiah accused the false prophets of his day of saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. Jeremiah 6:14. Ezekiel levels almost the same charge at prophets who seduced my people, saying, peace, and there was no peace. Ezekiel 13:10. Amos warned that the day of the Lord is darkness and not light, for those assuming it would only bring good. Amos 5:18-20. Zephaniah described the day of the Lord as near and swift, a day of wrath arriving while people felt secure. Zephaniah 1:14-16. And Isaiah, describing that same day, reaches for the identical image Paul later uses. Pangs and sorrows shall take hold of them. They shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. Isaiah 13:8. By the time Paul writes to Thessalonica, false peace before sudden judgment wasn't a new idea. It was one of the most consistent threads in the entire prophetic tradition, and he's simply the latest voice carrying it forward. As travail upon a woman with child, this image, birth pains, is the same one Jesus uses in Mark 13:8, describing wars, earthquakes, and famines as the beginning of sorrows, more literally, the beginning of birth pains. It's not a metaphor for gentleness. It's a metaphor for something with a defined starting point that, once begun, cannot be paused, postponed, or negotiated with. Paul's choosing an image his readers, many of them mothers, all of them living without modern anesthetic, would have felt in their bodies, not just understood with their minds. How the church has wrestled with this warning across history. Here's something genuinely interesting about this passage's history. For the first 3 centuries after Paul wrote it, the church reading these words was, like the Thessalonians, an often persecuted minority under Rome. The world says peace clearly wasn't describing them. Christians were the ones being fed to lions, not the ones enjoying Rome's security. The warning was aimed outward, at a confident empire that didn't share their faith. Then, in 313 AD, everything shifted. The Edict of Milan ended official persecution, and within a century, Christianity became the empire's favored religion. Suddenly, expositors faced a genuinely difficult question. Now that Rome's peace and the church were no longer opposites, what did Paul's warning even mean? Early church writers had to reckon with the fact that political peace and spiritual complacency aren't the same danger, and that this passage was warning against the second, not the first. That distinction between outward political calm and inward spiritual alertness is exactly why this verse has remained relevant through completely different political situations for 2,000 years. It was never really about Rome specifically. Rome was just the first, most obvious example its first readers could recognize. I want to pause the teaching here and be careful about something, because this is exactly the kind of passage that gets misused by people trying to sell fear. Paul is not handing anyone a date. He tells us that explicitly, 3 verses earlier. This isn't a puzzle to decode from headlines. It's a posture to hold in every generation, including whichever one happens to be reading this. That said, it's worth noticing, carefully, without claiming certainty, what's actually in the news this month, because Paul's language of peace and safety, as a public proclamation, isn't abstract right now. In November of last year, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 2803, endorsing a U.S.-brokered, comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. That plan established the current ceasefire, secured a hostage release, and created a transitional governing body for Gaza, referred to in reporting as the Board of Peace, alongside an international stabilization force to monitor the truce. That's an actual international body, formally created, with the word peace in its name, currently operating. At the same time, further east, a fragile ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, reached after a war that began earlier this year, is holding, but tensely. In the final days of June, Iran's Revolutionary Guard struck 2 commercial vessels near the Strait of Hormuz, including one flying under the Singapore flag, while the U.S. struck Iranian coastal and military infrastructure in response. Talks are continuing in Doha to try to hold the peace together. And Iran's supreme leader died recently. His funeral, drawing diplomats from several major world powers, only just concluded. I'm not telling you those specific events mean anything is imminent. Nobody watching this, including me, gets to know that. What I am saying is that the pattern Paul described 2,000 years ago, a world confidently proclaiming peace and security, right as tension keeps flaring beneath the surface, is a pattern Scripture keeps returning to, from Jeremiah's day to Paul's day. It's worth simply noticing, without turning that noticing into a prediction. And they shall not escape, but you are not in darkness his way. Here's where the passage turns. And this is the part I think gets skipped most often. Verse 3 ends with judgment for them, but verse 4 pivots hard. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. The contrast is the entire point. Paul spends verses 5 through 8 building it out. Ye are all the children of light, and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep, as do others, but let us watch and be sober. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night. But let us, who are of the day, be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for an helmet, the hope of salvation. That armor language deliberately echoes Isaiah 59:17, where God himself is described putting on righteousness as a breastplate and salvation as a helmet. And it resurfaces again later in Ephesians 6, where Paul builds out the fuller, whole armor of God. 3 separate passages, one consistent picture. The confidence God's people are meant to carry isn't manufactured by favorable circumstances. It's issued, like armor, and it's meant to be worn regardless of what the headlines say that week. What this actually looks like, practically to et mus. So what does staying awake and sober actually mean day to day, rather than just as a phrase? I'd point to 3 things this passage itself suggests. First, verse 11 says, "To comfort yourselves together and edify one another," which means this was never meant to be carried alone. Staying spiritually alert has always been a community practice, not a solo one, which is part of why isolating yourself with nothing but prophecy content and no local church community around you tends to produce more anxiety, not less. Second, the breastplate of faith and love language means the posture Paul's describing is active, not passive. It's something you put on deliberately, the way you'd get dressed for a day you know will be demanding. And third, hope here is explicitly tied to salvation, not to political outcomes, which means your sense of security was never supposed to rise and fall with a ceasefire holding or breaking in the first place. So if you're someone who reads headlines about ceasefires and oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz and feels your stomach tighten a little more than it used to, I don't think Paul's answer is, watch the news more closely for clues. I think it's closer to the opposite. Your footing was never supposed to be built on whether the headlines stay calm. It's built on faith, love, and hope, the very things Rome's Pax Romana never actually had to offer, and the very things a modern-day board of peace can't manufacture either. If a slow, verse-by-verse look like this is useful to you, tell me in the comments which passage you want covered next. I read every one. And if you're new here, this channel walks through Revelation and the rest of the New Testament's end times teaching the same way, verse by verse, without the sensationalism. Check out the last video if you want to keep going. Thanks for spending this time with me today.